we're living in a world where machines are going to be surpassing human intelligence. And so there's a question of what the value added is of being human. What is going to be, as it were, the brand difference, right? If you're going to talk about brand human, how is that different from brand AI?
You're listening to the Futures Podcast, live from the Festival of Innovation at the University of Warwick, a day that showcases human ingenuity. On this show, we meet the scientists, technologists, artists, and philosophers working to imagine the sorts of developments that might dramatically alter what it means to be human. Some of their predictions will be preferable, others might seem impossible, but none of them are inevitable. My name is Luke Robert Mason, and I'm your host for this session. Sam Altman, the founder of OpenAI, the makers of ChatGPT, said this week, "My kid is never going to grow up being smarter than artificial intelligence." As we are increasingly told that technology can suppress our humanity or even surpass our humanity, what is the value add of being human? Well, someone who's been grappling with this question is University of Warwick sociologist, Professor Steve Fuller. So, Steve, welcome to the Futures Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, Steve, this question of what it means to be human has always been central to your work. But what is it you mean by human when you use that word?
Okay, well, the first thing people need to realize is that human is an adjective, right? And so in a sense, it's a kind of quality. And then the question becomes, what is the nature of the quality and to what does the quality apply? Starting in the mid-18th century, we came up with this idea that to be human is to be Homo sapiens, which is a certain kind of upright ape. But prior to that time, human was a relatively free-floating adjective, you might say, that could apply to lots of things if they had certain kinds of characteristics. And so in this respect, you might want to think about what human means as connected to the humanities, for example, or being humane. And generally speaking, especially in the history of the West, where the notion of human really became prominent, it's been very closely tied to being educated in a certain way that others who are similarly educated recognize. So there's this issue of mutual recognition that takes place among humans as well. But it's only starting in the 18th century that we start to really kind of focus on the idea of a certain kind of upright ape as being the exclusive bearer of being human. But prior to that time, and I would argue as we move into the future, it's going to be a much kind of more loosely applied adjective.
Now, you've been playing with this idea that humanity is a luxury brand. So what do you mean by that?
Okay, so in a sense, the thing I want to read into the word luxury is that it's elite in the sense that it has a very distinctive character to it, right? Boutique might be another word for it, right? And I think this is kind of an important thing to bring out given the kind of world we live in now. Because as you were saying in the introduction, for example, we're living in a world where machines are going to be surpassing human intelligence, or at least the kinds of intelligence that humans have traditionally valued. And so there's a question of what the value added is of being human under those circumstances where it would seem that the human has a lot of competitors, right? And so what is going to be, as it were, the brand difference, right? If you're going to talk about brand human, how is that different from brand AI, right? And so it's a branding issue, actually, in a marketplace that is in a sense becoming increasingly crowded, and so that's the spirit in which I enter into this discussion.
This idea of humanity being able to differentiate itself from AI, what are some of the ways historically humanity has differentiated itself?
Okay, well, so first of all, we have to think about AI and machines generally as being on one side of the issue. On the other side of the issue, of course, is animals. Right, and especially once we started thinking about humans as being a particular kind of upright ape, then the question is, okay, how does that differ from the kinds of intelligence, let's say, and the kinds of other dispositions that animals have? What makes humans distinctive in that context? Now, you see, I think in the world we live in now, in the early 21st century, in a sense, both the animal issue and the machine issue are impinging on the human in a very unique way. Because, of course, during this period that we live in, we're becoming increasingly aware and valuing animal intelligence in all its forms and recognizing it as being different from human, right? And at the same time, we already recognize that artificial intelligence displays its own kinds of intelligence, some of which imitate humans, but other parts, in a sense, humans can't really fathom, right? Especially among in artificial intelligences that are self-programming. So there's a sense in which in this increasingly crowded environment where humans have to distinguish themselves, it's actually kind of a tricky issue. And one of the things that I've been arguing, and this goes to the issue of humans as an asset, is that humanity's become a kind of stranded asset because we keep on thinking that there are other things that in a way can do better than what humans traditionally have done. And so then we go back to the question, what is the added value of being human?
Well, life and intelligence are two of these things that we associate with human beings, but those terms, those categories...
They're not unique to humans.
In what way has that changed, Steve?
Well, the thing is now we have many more concrete examples of this. And in a sense, in principle, we've always kind of known this. And of course, throughout history, especially if you think about the animal side, if you talk about humane treatment, well, historically that's applied to animals because we've seen in animals that they have human-like characteristics. And it's only in the 19th century when we start thinking of the human as a particular kind of ape that then the word anthropomorphism, right, the attribution of human qualities to non-human beings starts to take on a negative connotation. But prior to that time, it was fairly normal, right? Human was kind of something that could be attributed to lots of things, and Homo sapiens had to earn being human. And that's where the issue of education was always very important. You may be born, as it were, with the potential to be human as an upright ape, but you actually have to go through some kind of training and recognition process so that other humans recognize you as humans. And by the way, an issue that's also on the horizon here, which we probably will not explore, but I think it's worth your audience thinking about, is extraterrestrials, right? The search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And of course, we frame that issue as an issue of intelligence. But if you think about the way we go about doing it, right, we're obviously looking for a form of intelligence that can communicate with us. Right? And so that communicative function brings in the humanity through the back door, you might say.
So these terms, these ideas of life and intelligence, they're no longer unique properties associated with humans, is what you're telling us there. But do you think that's a category error? Do you think we're making a mistake by anthropomorphizing, by assigning these human-like qualities to what would commonly be considered artificial things?
No, see, that's the thing. The notion of human actually predates our hooking it up to an upright ape, right? So in other words, the origin of being human, in a sense, historically has been nebulous, right? And so, as it were, we shouldn't be, as it were, cis-human, as we might say, by thinking only upright apes can be human. Right. So the idea, if you look at something like Aesop's fables, right? So you have these fables where these animals are doing all these various things that are very human-like. When Aesop was writing that stuff in ancient Greece, he thought, right, that in a sense these animals actually exhibited these human-like qualities, sometimes in a kind of purer form than the humans themselves did, because the humans have a lot of other stuff going on, but the animals can, as it were, bear these qualities of nobility or whatever, or jealousy or whatever the quality happens to be, because they're simpler creatures. And so that idea, of the human as coming from many different places, not just being tied to one origin, right, is actually historically quite a valid one, and I think we're returning to it to a large extent. So we can actually imagine a kind of community of humanity that, from the standpoint of the composition of the creatures in it, could be Homo sapiens, could be other kinds of animals, and could be machines.
Don't you think that gives humanity a form of self-esteem crisis? If there's nothing special about us, if the properties that we hold with value can be assigned to other entities, then what is that value add of being human?
Well, a lot depends on what the properties are, right? I mean, so the distinctiveness doesn't come from the range of beings that can have it, but rather it comes from the nature of the properties. right? And so, as it were, any being could have it, but you have to have certain properties. So it's a bit, there's a sense in which, sometimes I compare it to this, citizenship. Right. So in a sense, you can imagine the idea of citizenship, that all kinds of people who are born in lots of different places can become citizens of a different country, at least, as long as Donald Trump's not president. But the thing is that in order to be a citizen, right, you have to pass certain tests, right? And the test might have, and the tests vary in different countries. It could have to do with a test about knowing something about the culture or something like that, being able to integrate, as this word often gets used, right? So you can actually, as it were, be one of the people who normally live in the country, and you can interact and be productive among them. And so there's a sense in which humanity, you might say, is subject to a kind of citizenship criteria. And then the interesting question is, what is in that, right? So in other words, what are we talking about as the criteria for being human, regardless of what kind of being we're talking about that might be human? And I think that's kind of where the issue is right now. And it's a tricky one. It's quite a tricky one, because one of the things that we know about the nature of the human is it's very protean, right? It changes over time, right? And even if we're talking about general sorts of terms, like compassion or intelligence or, consciousness even, the kinds of things that we take to be criterial of those qualities have actually changed over time, right? So it's a kind of a tricky task in a way, and that's why my general attitude toward this is a kind of open-mindedness, right? That we shouldn't have a very rigid notion of what it means to be human, but at the same time, we should be able, in some sense, to be able to tell whether something is human or not human. Can I give you an example?
Please.
Okay. Well, so in artificial intelligence, there's this thing called the uncanny valley. Right? The uncanny valley is when basically you have a robot that it looks very much like a human in the Homo sapiens sense, right? So it has a very strong resemblance to a Homo sapiens. But there's something about the way it acts, right? Its performance as a human is faulty in some way, right? Regardless, and that's despite the fact that it looks very much like a Homo sapiens. Whereas you could take other forms of artificial intelligence, and I would say, even the kinds of, animations you now see in the movies, right, which don't really look much like humans at all, right? They look like these kind of hybrid, cyborg, whatever kind of entities. But nevertheless, they display human qualities much more naturally. Right, with their kind of non-Homo sapien, constitution, they nevertheless are able to display and exhibit these kinds of, very strongly recognizable human qualities. So there's a sense in which there's a detachment, you might say, from, as it were, the look of the Homo sapiens and the qualities that make something human, right? And so that's what makes the problem of what it means to be human interesting, because it's not simply a matter of physical resemblance by any means. Right? The physical resemblance can be caught out as not being human.
So providing we can agree on the categories, agree on the properties, then the adjective of human could be applied to robots, animals, or even extraterrestrials.
Right. And animation and avatars and, all the other stuff that currently populates our world. So yes. And in fact, I do think, as we, there are actually a lot of political and economic reasons for thinking that we should get our heads around this idea, because in some sense, if we're going to live in a sustainable world, we're going to have to create a kind of a balanced regime with all these different entities that are impinging upon us.
So how would we do that, Steve? Would we subspeciate? Would we live among the animals and the robots? Or
well, I do. Okay, so here's an interesting issue, right? And it's one that, in a way, has recently come to the fore because of Donald Trump's big boost to AI and having all these tech guys behind him and wanting to give a big kind of economic boost to artificial intelligence. And so this has to do with the energy consumption of artificial intelligence. So that if we have a world that is highly populated by artificial intelligence, given the current energy demands, now this might change if, let's say, quantum computing comes on board and we get some other way, as it were, of constructing computers that are not so energy intensive. We're basically going to blow the sockets of the planet pretty quickly if we have a world that's increasingly moving in the direction of artificial intelligence. And if you look at, for example, if you compare the human brain, in Homo sapiens, to artificial intelligence, even if artificial intelligence can surpass human capabilities in particular tasks or even a multitude of tasks, nevertheless, the amount of energy it needs to consume to do that, right, is vastly outstrips what a human brain needs, even if a human brain, in a way, is somewhat more fallible and does not quite have the comprehensiveness that artificial intelligence have. The energy consumption comparisons, definitely favor the brain. And so it seems to me that, we need to kind of that's kind of I would say that's part of the backdrop against which we need to think about this kind of balance between having different kinds of beings, in our human world. Because even though we are very impressed by artificial intelligence, and justifiably in terms of its ability to, simulate and surpass human qualities, it may not be sustainable, right, in the way it is at the moment. And so, I am mindful that we have ecological concerns, right? And if you look at animal brains and things like that, they're very energy efficient too. So it seems to me that this is kind of you might say, a kind of indirect materialist argument for wanting to have a more expansive notion of humanity, in which you're taking on board lots of things and then sort of considering in the round how sustainable they are.
So you're saying the one special thing about human beings is their energy consumption of the human brain.
Well, I do think that's not a trivial point, given the kinds of indicators that we tend to use to compare, human beings, in the material, literal sense, is in fact energy efficiency, is in fact, something that cannot be sneezed at.
Well, we're at the Festival of Innovation, and do you think there's other ways, innovative ways, in which humanity has differentiated itself?
Well, one of the things that and I've already alluded to this in one of my answers, is that humanity is very protean, right? It's always been changing in terms of how it envisages itself. So even if it uses a lot of the same concepts to describe what it means to be human, so consciousness and rationality and intelligence and all that, nevertheless, the criteria have changed, the manifestations of it have changed. And indeed, evolutionary biologists have been saying for a while that one of the distinctive species characteristics of Homo sapiens, which may be something that the human has in the more general sense I'm talking about, is fashion. And that is the idea of continual reinvention. Continual reinvention. And of course, in the context of innovation more generally, right, this kind of continual reinvention is associated with the creative destructive character of innovation, right? The fact that you take existing markets and existing ways of organizing life and so forth, and you reconfigure them in a way that bring out a lot of what people have always wanted, but in a new way. And I think of the concept of the human very much, as having that kind of trajectory.
Well, we have an ability to creatively destroy and then reinvent. So on that curious note, I just want to thank you for joining us for the Futures Podcast live from the Festival of Innovation at the University of Warwick. If you like what you've heard, then you can find out more by visiting futurespodcast.net. Please put your hands together and join me in thanking Professor Steve Fuller.
Thank you. Thank you, Luke.